You're listening to Tonebenders, the Sound Designers Podcast. Let's do this.
Hey everybody, welcome to Tonebenders. My name is Tim Muirhead and I will be your host today. We have a couple of special guests sitting in with us to talk about their work on the new release film, Harriet, which chronicles the life history of the iconic Harriet Tubman and her harrowing work on the Underground Railway in the 1800s.
Do you know what would happen if you got caught? They would torture you until you pointed them right to this office. You got lucky, Harriet. And there's nothing more you can do.
Don't you tell me what I can't do. I made it this far on my own. God was watching, but my feet was my own. Running, bleeding, climbing, nearly drowned, nothing to eat for days and days, man. I made it. So don't you tell me what I can't do.
Tasked to make the authentic soundscape for this time period were supervising sound editor and re-recording mixer Blake Leyh, who has also worked on Into the Woods, The Wire, and was an Emmy winner for the sound of the HBO series Treme. Blake, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Also joining us is Skip Lievsay. Skip has been on our show previously in episode 76. If you're not familiar with his work, you're probably in the wrong business. Skip is an Oscar winner, Golden Globe Reel winner, CAS winner, who's worked on all-time classics like No Country for Old Men, Gravity, Do the Right Thing, Casino, and last year's tour de force, Roma. Welcome to the show, Skip.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I see that you guys have both worked together all the way back to 1991's Barton Fink. How did you guys originally cross paths?
Good question.
Yeah. We met over ramen at Sapporo. We both used to go there, and somehow we discovered that we also both did the same thing. I think Barton Fink was the first movie that we shared a credit on, but we knew each other before then. I was here working on State of Grace. Was the first time we spent time together.
Blake and Dodie Doran had a very famous sound editing company in Los Angeles, and we both have this Los Angeles connection with sound editor Jerry Ross and mixer Doug Hemphill, and there's a whole cast of characters out there that we separately and collectively know and hang with over the years. And Blake's company, Sonic Kitchen, was like the breakout Young Turks, Blake and Doe.
We did the sound on The Abyss, on the James Cameron film The Abyss in 1988. That was the Sonic Kitchen thing. And I had worked with, I kind of started out at Cannon Films, with the now legendary C-movie Schlockmeisters, the Israeli guys, Menachem and Yoram, and Jerry Ross. I knew Jerry from there.
Jerry was there. Yeah.
So how many films have you guys worked on together now, do you think?
Hundreds. We did Y Tu Mama Tambien. Blake supervised and I mixed a version, which got improved beyond all recognition by Tom Fleischman a little while later. That's how we met Alfonso. That's how I met Alfonso.
Right.
And I think actually we were helped along by Joel Cohen on that introduction.
I do think that Harriet was the first time we sat next to each other at a console for a whole mix. For a long time, I didn't really like mixing. I did a lot of pre-mixing and mixed small films where I could work in my own room. But for years, I liked supervising. I liked being the person who could get up and leave the room. I'm not that good with sitting in a chair for 8 hours, having clients look at the back of my neck and tell me what to do. And I kind of just got over that eventually. I just couldn't deal anymore with doing all of the work, 98% of the work, and then handing it to someone else who would sit in the chair. So I just decided, okay, I'm only going to do sound design and sound work on movies now if I can also mix. Because I also do a lot of music work, supervising, and I work as a composer. So I can go back and forth.
Let's talk about the film Harriet. I saw it in the theater over the weekend. There's a really interesting technique being used. Apparently, the real-life Harriet Tubman was injured as a child. Going into her adulthood, she would have what is described as spells. There's a visual difference between when it's plot and when she's going into the spells. How did you guys tackle those sound-wise?
Well, it's actually a motif that Casey Lemons, the director, has used in all of her films. It's a device that she's used to have dream sequences and people seeing the future, seeing things that aren't necessarily happening. That was probably the biggest challenge from a sound design point of view, was how to treat those sequences. And we tried a lot of different things. It's really more akin to scoring, really. But you still want what happens during those sequences to not just be score, because you need the storytelling aspect to be there. It needs to feel different than just a slightly different piece of music. So we were experimenting with a lot of different ideas for a long time before there was any score. So with bowing strings and air moving over different surfaces, grass and metal and bird sounds, insect sounds, a lot of different things. And we ended up with a mixture of a bunch of different things, fire sounds, sort of elemental sounds, and just hit upon a combination that seemed to work.
In the early part of the film, when she goes into her spells, there's a rumble, which I thought was thunder, maybe. But then in the last time she goes into a spell, there is a stampede. Is that stampede kind of, I was going to say being echoed, but it's prior. Is that what you used to make those sounds earlier on?
Yeah, well, you do see those running feet in the climax of the film. There's it's sort of revealed during those visions earlier in the film. You hear and see many slaves running. You don't know that's what it is the first several times you see it, and then it's revealed. So that idea pays off at the end of the film when it's thousands of slaves being freed and running towards the water. But yeah, the very first time she falls into one of those, we called them visions, we do hear those rumbling feet running. I don't remember if it's in the script or not, but it was certainly in the edit, the visual idea of using the slaves running feet. And so we followed that visual idea and illustrated it with sound.
So how is the production dialogue in this? How is the dialogue mix? Were you guys stuck with planes flying overhead in the production dialogue or anything like that?
Yes, of course. And there's hardly a place you can be on the planet where there aren't planes flying overhead at some height, either closer or higher up. But we did have really good track. In general, we had a very good recording for every line in the movie. There were a few exceptions, and there was a little bit of ADR done because of that, and there was ADR done for other reasons, of course, matching and performance issues. But I would say in general it was good track. It wasn't like a super hyper clean or anything. And Blake and I have been wondering lately why all of a sudden in the autumn of our careers we're starting to get really high quality recordings. When we were young and enthusiastic, we had the worst recordings imaginable. It would have been nice if we had the really good recordings when we were young, and then we get the bad ones now, and we would have learned how to deal with them by now. But unfortunately,
I like it this way around, because now we can just relax and do less and leave work early and go drinking instead of having to stay till midnight cleaning up tracks.
No doubt.
There's insects in this show. There's a lot of exteriors with insects. Was that a tough thing to tackle, or were you adding more insects to cover things up, or how did you go about that?
It's a two-parter. I mean, I try to filter away. Basically, in America, most of the crickets are around 4K, but it changes with temperature down into the 3,000 cycle range. But it is actually pretty narrow, so you can make a pretty good dent by using a little notch filter, and you have to be careful not to ruin the phase relationship, which filtering in that range will really hit hard. Just knock it down a bit and then do some nice crossfading between the pieces. Then you can completely solve the problem by adding a similar sweet background. That's a solution that we have, which I've never had it not work. It always works well enough. And the only time when it's a little bit challenging is when it's winter, or it's not winter being shot for winter, and you see snow, but you hear crickets. It's like, that is not cool, and then it can be a problem.
Also, Casey, the director, and Wyatt Smith, the editor, they basically could never have enough insect sounds, so we were always adding more and more. Just their taste. Casey had been in the South shooting the film and was really quite taken with how loud the insects are, which is true that, if you go out in a field in South Carolina in the middle of the summer, the insects are improbably loud. It's quite surprising, louder than the movie convention, for sure.
Sure.
So she was like, oh, when we were there shooting this, the insects were so loud, make them louder.
Well, that's a luxury because in my experience, directors are always trying to minimize insects. So that was something I noticed while watching the movie is that they're prominent isn't the right word, but they're there. It feels real.
I would say they're prominent. I mean, not
Yeah.
really the backgrounds. I mean, that's one thing I like about the track we ended up with. The way the movie sounds when it's all said and done is the insects and the birds too. They're very full and very loud and very noticeable. And there was none of that like lower the backgrounds. You know, some filmmakers they don't like to hear the sounds of the environment that much. You're right that they're saying lower the insects, just lower the environmental sounds in general. And this was a case where it wasn't like that. Filmmaker really liked to feel the presence of nature and the presence of the environments.
It's nice to hear a film that has some volume to it, but it isn't all crash, boom, bang. You know what I mean? Like it's a fairly quiet film, but I bet by the actual meters, it's not actually that quiet.
I've given in to the idea of trying to make a really widely dynamic mix, and there's a kind of a game that you can play where you have a very dynamic track, and then gradually people say, I can't hear that, you know, can you raise that? I can't hear what they're saying. And then some people I know will actually go to, I can't hear that syllable. If I can't hear that syllable, we don't have a movie, you know. So you can only endure that kind of silliness for so long before you start making every syllable really loud. And I've sort of gradually given into that concept, and during the process I go through a silly charade of making all the syllables and words, you know, fairly loud so everyone can hear everything. And if we have time and patience, we can make it a little more dynamic, but most filmmakers won't complain. I'm thinking of the Coens, for instance. They're perfectly happy to hear every single syllable and phrase at a fairly loud level, even though it's not terribly natural.
So left to your own devices, you would be quite tolerant of losing the intelligibility of some of the dialogue to have the overall feeling be more natural and more pleasing to the ear?
Yeah, I like the idea of a movie being part documentary where, you know, an event is happening, whether it's a dreamed up performance or something that's more searching for realism. Realism is about things that you don't catch every single word, and sometimes you hear incorrectly what's happening. And there is a kind of thing about theater in particular, but also about movies where they're written by writers, and writers want to hear every single note. And I think sometimes that makes it more like theater and less like cinema. And I like the idea. I mean, I'll never forget a movie I worked on where the picture editor was the composer also, and he was really driven to dynamic range. And basically everything I did, he would say, oh, that's way too loud. Alfonso Cuarón is also really into dynamic range. So we would spend, a good third of my time was spent lowering stuff that I had made too loud. And I like the dynamic range is so exciting about cinema, where you can have things that are very quiet and people really have to strain to hear, and then things are really loud and they're pushed back in their seats. And it's a part of the art process that you forego if you just make everything loud enough so that every single syllable is audible to the writers or to the studio. Studio people basically make scripts, and their thing is about words. It's not about cinema. And they hire writers and they make written pages. And to them, really, this is my experience, nothing is more important than what's written on the pages. And they want to hear every single syllable. So I'm not saying that's wrong, I'm just saying that leads you in one direction, pulls you in one direction. And I think probably filmmakers and certainly artistic filmmakers like Cuarón are feel the pull, I think, of making something more documentary.
There's a good moment in Harriet that's kind of what you're saying. Right near the top, her husband comes to her with a piece of paper, and they start hugging, and you're not sure exactly what's on the piece of paper, and they're walking away, and you get the impression that they're talking about it, but you're losing the intelligibility of what they're saying as they walk off into the distance in the shot. And then it cuts to a spiritual being sung, and then you find out like 5 minutes later what's on the paper. Like, you have to wait for that payoff.
Yeah, I think that's a nod from Casey to the idea of cinema. It's part of a bigger thing. It's not just what people say moment to moment.
I think about it often in terms of a tolerance for ambiguity. So I've worked with David Simon for almost 20 years now on every project he's done. And I mean, he's someone, even though he's a writer who writes all the words, he's not at all interested in catering to the audience's comfort and discomfort with ambiguity, because in life and in art, things can have more than one meaning. And if every single thing is explained to an audience, it's a question of taste. But I mean, certainly big corporate entertainment is not about subjecting the audience to ambiguity. It's about making the audience feel very comfortable. They know what to expect. They know what they're going to hear. They know how to react to it when it happens. And other kinds of more artistic work and storytelling have a much greater tolerance for ambiguity. And I'm always interested in that. I'm interested in ambiguity and supporting that idea. And you don't have to handhold the audience every second of the way and make sure. So it's okay if, I mean, working with David, I mix the music on all of his stuff, and it's there's a lot of times where he's like, it doesn't matter if we understand the dialogue in this scene. They're in a bar, they're yelling at each other, and by the end of the scene and by the end of the next stuff, you know what's going on. You don't have to hear every word. Let's have it feel real. It's two people in a bar trying to understand each other. So, and not just bars, but all kinds of other noisy environments. And, so there are a lot of times where, you decide it's okay to not hear stuff.
There's another aspect to it, which is the studio executives who make the scripts their idea is that we have to tell the audience everything that's happening. They're writing words on a page. There's no imagery, there's no sound. They're using words to make the audience understand what's happening. There's absolutely no artistic contribution to that beyond the language itself. There's no cinema in the pages. The studios actually don't work with artistic cinematic filmmaking. That's not part of their day-to-day. To the degree that they can imagine it, it's there. If you look at it from the other side of the camera, the filmmakers live in an artistic cinematic world where people stand in front of the camera and get in their shot and say the words. It's a almost diametrically opposed proposition between the people who are in charge of making the movies and getting the money and the people they hire to do the work. It doesn't always work that way. It's not always important to hear every single thing. The number of times that I've been in meetings where we're working on a film and there's some issue that the studio executives have, and somebody will start talking about a scene 37 that wasn't even shot, and they'll say, well, in scene 37, well, that explains because his brother Bob was in a car accident, and we're like, that is not helping. We're trying to do a movie now. Scene 37 doesn't exist for all intents and purposes, and it's a big problem for executives to get over what existed in the script that was then, and now we have a movie, and actually they're not really connected anymore. I worked with one filmmaker. There was one scene that I really liked. I really liked the actor Christopher Lee, and I just really enjoyed what was happening, and gradually that scene got edited down and more, and finally there was none of the language there. It was like 10 pages. And I said to the filmmaker, like, what's happening there? Do you not like what happened? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, this was a really nice scene, and I particularly liked the way it was shot and the performances. And he said, you mean all the dialogue is gone? And I said, yeah. And he goes, oh, you don't want to hear them say that stuff. That's all just junk. That's all just, he's explained to me, the script informs the actors, it helps inform the actors about what they're supposed to be doing. You don't need to hear the words. because 90% of what's happening is in their body language and their facial expression, their reactions to each other. So you can have far less of all that yapping, but it helps the actors inhabit the character. If they say a whole bunch of stuff, it gives them something to bite on and to like hang on. And that helps their reactions and their physical relation to the other actors. That's all being stirred up by having these dialogues. And he's like, oh God, no, you don't want to hear them say all that stuff. That's all just a bunch of junk. Get that out of there. It's so much nicer now. We just see them like together with Christian Bale, like looking at each other, and the very few lines that are there are infused with all this subtext and emotion because you see it on their faces and the way they're standing and looking at each other. And I'm like, okay, wow, shit, I didn't know any of that stuff. Are you kidding? That's the way it works?
How much of that comes into the mix room when the studio executives come down to watch a playback?
A lot. I mean, it's always there in the room. For my part, as a mixer, I do what the filmmaker tells me to do. And I understand, I try to appreciate the different points of view because that helps me do my job. But whatever the filmmaker decides, I have to side with them no matter what I think. It's their movie. We are part of the filmmaker's process. We are not part of the studio process. Only the filmmaker is part of the studio process. It would be like if the people who manufactured the paint and the brushes came into the studio and tried to tell the painter whether they were doing a good job or not. Whether the paint is appropriate or not is totally up to the painter, not to the manufacturer in this case. I mean, that's a pretty coarse corollary, but still, just the same.
I think that's generous to describe studio executives as the manufacturers of the paint. I think they're like the profiteers who make money off of arms or something like that. Yeah, I've already retired actually, so I can just say whatever I think about those morons who work for the studios and come in here and tell us what to do.
Okay. Have you ever found yourself in between the studio people and the filmmaker?
Every minute that they're in the room.
Just let them fight it out and wait for the filmmaker to give you the instruction?
You have to. It's really up to them. It's not our involvement is so important that we maintain our relationship with the filmmaker so that they can trust us to do what they ask in response to what they've been asked to by the studio. It's crucial that we act as their agent on the soundtrack. It's really, really important. Even if you have a good idea or an opinion, it's much better to express it to the filmmaker and not choose sides. Blake, do you agree with what I just said?
Oh, totally.
Okay,
I absolutely agree. Yeah.
I
I work for the filmmaker. I mean, I've left projects. If the director leaves a project, I leave too. You could not pay me enough money to service the studio's ideas of what to do with the film if that's not what the filmmaker wanted. Not all the sound people feel that way. There are a lot of people who are like, whoever pays my paycheck is who they get to tell me what to do. But yeah.
Speaking of directors, is this your first time working with Cassie?
It's not my first time working with Casey. I've worked with her on her last film, Black Nativity. I was involved with the music, and I've known her for a number of years. We've had mutual friends in common, and we're neighbors in Harlem. And she's so talented and has a really unique perspective, and it's great to see Harriet being well received by audiences. I hope she gets to make many, many more films.
I second that, of course.
Well, we'll end on that note. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. Harriet's playing all around right now, so everybody go out and take a chance to go see it while it's in the theaters, and you can hear those crickets loud and strong.
And hear those visions.
On the piano note.
Yes, exactly.
All right, cool. Well, this was great.
Thank you, Tim.
Tonebenders is produced by Timothy Muirhead, Renee Coronado, and Teresa Morrow. Theme music is by Mark Strait. Send your emails to info@tonebenderspodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter via @thetonebenders and join Tonebenders Podcast on Facebook. Support this podcast. You can use our links when you shop with Amazon or B&H, or leave us a tip. Just go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click the support button. Thanks for listening.